The first thing that hit me wasn't the shouting. It was the sound of my front door rattling like it was about to come off its hinges. It was still early morning at our quiet lakeside cabin in Ridgewater Cove, Missouri, the kind of hour when the water is glassy and the world feels half asleep. Then everything exploded at once. Armed deputies and tactical officers poured inside, rifles raised, voices overlapping, commands firing in every direction. My 14-year-old son, Evan, stood frozen in the hallway, his face drained of color, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't even speak. Before I could process what was happening, I was shoved to the floor in front of him, zip ties biting into my wrists, while he cried and begged them not to hurt me. None of it made sense. There was no warning, no explanation, just chaos and fear burned straight into my son's memory. It wasn't until later that I learned the truth. The HOA president who lived across the lake, Linda Crowley, had called it in. She told police I was running a drug operation out of the cabin. As they led me outside, I saw her standing calmly on her deck, coffee in hand, watching like this was entertainment she'd scheduled. That moment changed everything for me and for my son. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? To understand why all of this cut so deep, you have to understand what that cabin meant to us. It wasn't just a weekend place or some investment property. It was a small, weathered lakeside cabin my grandfather built with his own hands decades ago, long before anyone had ever heard the phrase homeowners association. He raised my father there. I spent summers there as a kid. And after my divorce, it became the one place where my son, Evan, could breathe again. No arguments, no lawyers, no tension hanging in the air. Just water, trees, and quiet mornings where he could sit on the dock and feel normal. Ridgewater Cove hadn't always been the polished place it was turning into. For most of its history, it was simple cabins, fishing boats, and neighbors who waved because they actually knew your name. That started changing a few years back when developers came in and built a ring of large, modern homes along the lake. With them came the HOA, glossy newsletters, and eventually Linda Crowley. She rose to HOA president fast, the kind of person who loved microphones, meetings, and being seen as the one in charge. I heard her speak more than once about bringing Ridgewater Cove into a higher tier and cleaning up outdated properties that drag values down. Every time she said it, her eyes seemed to drift straight toward my cabin. At first, I didn't think much of it. I'd dealt with bureaucracy before. I figured if I followed the rules, kept my head down, everything would stay calm. That illusion didn't last long. The first letter arrived about dock spacing, claiming my dock was a few inches out of compliance. I measured it twice. It wasn't. Then came a warning about excessive noise on a night when Evan and I had been inside watching a movie with the volume barely above a whisper. After that, anonymous emails started showing up, phrased carefully but clearly meant to unsettle me. Comments about how I seemed unstable, how neighbors were concerned about my behavior, how maybe the cabin wasn't the right environment for a teenage boy. I kept responding politely. I sent photos. I asked for clarification. I assumed someone had made a mistake or that Linda was just overzealous and would eventually move on. Instead, the situation shifted from annoying to unsettling. One afternoon, a deputy showed up for a wellness check. He was professional, even apologetic, but the message landed hard anyway. Someone had called claiming they were worried about the safety of a minor at the cabin. Nothing came of it. The deputy left. But the damage was done. Then it happened again. And again. Anonymous tips. Inspectors arriving without warning. Officers knocking on the door with vague explanations that a concern had been raised. Every visit ended the same way. No issues, no violations, no cause for action, but they kept coming. And they always came at the worst possible times. Evan noticed before I did. He started asking why police cars drove by so slowly, He'd jump when he heard sirens on the highway miles away. One evening, when a cruiser passed on the road above the lake, he flinched so hard he spilled his drink. He stopped asking if friends could come over. When I pressed him about it, he finally admitted he was scared something bad would happen again, that someone would show up and take me away while he watched. That was the moment it clicked for me. This wasn't random. This wasn't concern. This wasn't enforcement. It was pressure. Someone was intentionally turning the systems meant to protect people into tools to intimidate us. The letters, the emails, the inspections, the police visits, they all pointed in one direction, across the water. Toward the woman who talked about cleaning up, the neighborhood, and watched my cabin like it offended her personally. I started paying attention to patterns instead of incidents. The calls came when Evan was home, when we were clearly visible outside, when family visited. They didn't come when the cabin was empty. They came when the impact would be greatest, and every single time, nothing was found. No violations, no danger. Just another official interaction logged somewhere with my name on it. That's when I realized something else too. This wasn't just about property values. This was about power. About making someone feel watched, exposed, and unsafe until they gave up and left on their own. And the worst part was knowing my son was the collateral damage. Every knock on the door, every flashing light reflected in the lake, chipped away at the one place where he was supposed to feel secure. I stopped telling myself it would blow over. I stopped assuming good intentions. Whatever this was, it was deliberate. And if I didn't start treating it that way, it wasn't going to stop on its own. After the first few visits from police and inspectors, I hoped the pressure would peak and then fade. Instead, Linda doubled down. Thick envelopes started arriving in the mail, each one more threatening than the last. They were cease and desist letters printed on cheap letterhead from a law office I'd never heard of, full of vague accusations and bold language meant to intimidate rather than inform. They warned me to correct my behavior, to bring the property into compliance, and to cease activities that endangered the community. None of them cited anything specific. No dates, no evidence, just fear wrapped in legal-sounding words. At the same time, the HOA newsletter changed its tone. Where it used to be full of gardening tips and reminders about trash pickup, it suddenly included ominous paragraphs about dangerous residents and uncooperative homeowners who refused to respect community standards. My name was never mentioned, but it didn't have to be. There were only a few older properties left by the lake, and mine was the most visible. Neighbors who used to wave from their decks started avoiding eye contact. A few stopped returning my calls altogether. Linda didn't stop there. She began knocking on doors, pressuring neighbors into signing petitions against me. Some people later admitted she told them the police were already building a case, and that signing was just a formality to protect property values. Others said she implied the cabin was unsafe for children and hinted that staying silent could put them at risk too. Fear spreads fast in tight communities, especially when it comes wrapped in official language and HOA letterhead. One night, things crossed another line. I woke up to the sound of footsteps on the dock. When I looked out the window, I saw a silhouette moving near the water. By the time I got outside, whoever it was gone. The next morning, I found muddy footprints and a new notice taped to the end of the dock claiming the lakefront was shared HOA property and that I was trespassing by maintaining it. That dock had been there longer than the HOA itself. Linda knew that. She just didn't care. The police visits became more frequent and more calculated. They showed up during Evan's online classes, knocking loudly enough that his teacher could hear it through the microphone. They came late at night, when every knock felt heavier and every shadow looked like a threat. They arrived when family members visited, turning what should have been normal gatherings into tense, awkward scenes. Each time, the officers were professional and polite, but I could see the confusion on their faces. They'd look around, ask a few questions, and eventually tell me the same thing. The report was unfounded. That word started echoing in my head. Unfounded. Again and again. Every call ended the same way, yet the calls never stopped. I realized then that the outcome didn't matter to Linda. The disruption was the point. I started documenting everything. Not casually, obsessively. I kept a notebook on the kitchen counter and wrote down dates, times, badge numbers, and incident references. I requested body camera numbers when I could. I saved every email, every letter, every HOA post. I installed cameras and backed the footage up in multiple places. If a cruiser drove by slowly, I noted it. If someone walked past the cabin and stared a little too long, I wrote it down. I treated my own life like a case file because that's what Linda had turned it into. Evan noticed the change in me. I was calmer on the surface but sharper underneath, more watchful, more deliberate. He asked me once if we'd done something wrong. That question hurt more than any letter or police visit. I told him the truth in the simplest way I could. Some people misuse power, and sometimes you have to protect yourself by being prepared. The confirmation I needed came from someone who had lived at the lake longer than almost anyone else. Harold Jenkins, a retired neighbor with a quiet voice and a habit of fishing at dawn, stopped me one morning near the shoreline. He glanced around before speaking, like he was afraid the trees might be listening. He told me Linda had been asking questions about my schedule. When I was at the cabin, when my son was there, when cars came and went. He said he'd overheard her telling people she was keeping an eye on a situation. Harold also told me about the rumors, that I was unstable, that I was hiding something, that the police just hadn't found it yet. He said it didn't sit right with him, and he wanted me to know what was being said behind my back. That conversation snapped everything into focus. This wasn't overzealous enforcement. This wasn't concern for the community. It was a coordinated effort to make my life uncomfortable enough that I'd leave on my own. Linda wasn't enforcing rules. She was manufacturing suspicion. And she was doing it with the confidence of someone who believed the system she was abusing would never turn back on her. Standing there by the water, watching the sun rise over the lake my family had known for generations, I understood something clearly for the first time. If I kept treating this like a misunderstanding, it would only get worse. This was harassment, plain and simple. And the only way it was going to stop was if I stopped reacting and started responding the right way, with patience, proof, and a record so complete it couldn't be ignored. The shift didn't come with a bang. It came with a conversation that felt almost casual, which somehow made it heavier. Deputy Mark Ellis was the one who finally said what the others only hinted at. He stood on the porch after yet another call that turned up nothing, glanced back toward his cruiser, and lowered his voice. He told me he'd responded to complaints before, but this was different. The timing, the frequency, the way the reports were worded, he said it wasn't normal. He said carefully that it was starting to look like a pattern. Then he gave me advice that changed everything. Keep every record, every detail, because false reporting doesn't stay a nuisance forever. Eventually, it crosses a line. That was the moment I stopped feeling like I was overreacting. A uniformed officer, someone with no stake in HOA politics or neighborhood grudges, had seen enough to be concerned. When he left, I didn't feel relieved. I felt focused. I went back through everything with fresh eyes. Not just the letters and reports, but the foundation of the conflict itself. I pulled out old documents my father had stored in a metal box under the stairs. Deeds, surveys, permits yellowed with age. And there it was, clear as day. The cabin wasn't just older than the HOA. It predated it by nearly 4 decades. The dock, the shoreline access, the structure itself, all established long before any HOA bylaws existed. That meant something Linda either didn't know or chose to ignore. A significant portion of her threats had no legal teeth. The realization was grounding. For weeks, everything had felt unstable, like I was standing on shifting sand. Now I had something solid under my feet. Linda could send letters. She could posture. She could scare neighbors. But the law didn't bend just because someone spoke loudly or confidently. Her power depended on intimidation, not legitimacy. That's when the situation changed again. Not in tone, but in nature. The first sign was subtle. One morning, I noticed the chain securing the dock gate was hanging loose. The lock bent just enough to look forced. I told myself it could have been weather or wear, but the knot in my stomach said otherwise. A day later, one of the exterior cameras went dark. No error message. No storm damage. Just gone. When I checked the footage from another angle, I saw movement near the dock late the night before. Faces obscured. Motions deliberate. Then it escalated. Items that had sat untouched for years were suddenly damaged. A wooden bench my grandfather carved had deep gouges in it, as if someone wanted it to look intentional. Near the fire pit, stones were rearranged into strange, unsettling shapes. Nothing overtly illegal, but enough to make anyone uneasy. Enough to suggest something was wrong. I stood there staring at it, feeling a cold anger settle in my chest. This wasn't enforcement. This wasn't even harassment by paperwork anymore. This was someone trying to provoke me, trying to make me react emotionally, trying to create a scene that could be pointed to later as proof of instability. Evan saw it too. He asked why someone would do that. I didn't have an answer that wouldn't scare him more, so I told him the truth in a way he could handle. Some people don't like being told no, and some people don't like losing control. I didn't tell him what I was thinking, that whoever was doing this wanted me to snap, to yell, to make a mistake that could be captured and used. Instead of reacting, I tightened everything down. I replaced the damaged cameras with better ones and added backups where no one would think to look. I stopped leaving anything to chance. If something moved, it was recorded. If something changed, it was noted. I backed up footage daily. I logged dates, times, and conditions. I didn't talk about it openly. I didn't confront Linda. I didn't give her the satisfaction of knowing she'd rattled me. The strange part was how calm I felt once I understood what was happening. Fear thrives in uncertainty. Clarity strips it of power. Someone wanted to escalate the conflict from paper to something messier. Someone wanted to blur the line between rumor and reality. And the worst thing I could do for them was play along. Deputy Ellis came back once more after another anonymous tip went nowhere. He looked at the cameras, the logs, the careful records spread out on the table. He nodded slowly and told me to keep doing exactly what I was doing. Let them talk. Let them act. The truth, he said, has a way of stacking up. That night, sitting by the lake, I watched the water ripple under the moonlight and thought about how quickly things had shifted. What started as letters and whispers had turned into something deliberate and invasive. Whoever was behind it believed pressure would break me. They believed fear would make me sloppy. They were wrong. This wasn't just about defending a cabin anymore. It was about protecting my son, my family's history, and my own name. And if someone wanted to push this into darker territory, then I was going to meet them there. Not with anger, but with patience, preparation, and a record so clean it would expose every move they made. Once it became clear that someone was willing to cross from intimidation into physical interference, I stopped relying on visibility alone. The cameras Linda already knew about weren't enough anymore. I installed small, hidden trail cameras in places no one would think to check, angled low along the tree line, tucked into weathered posts, disguised among rocks near the shoreline. They didn't blink or glow. They didn't announce themselves. They just watched, quietly, constantly. For about a week, nothing happened. The lake stayed calm. The dock stayed untouched. I almost wondered if the message I'd sent by upgrading security had worked. Then, one night just after midnight, my phone buzzed with an alert. Motion detected. I didn't rush outside. I didn't turn on lights. I sat at the kitchen table and watched the footage load. Two men moved onto the dock with practiced ease. They didn't stumble or hesitate. One knelt near the chains, while the other scanned the area like a lookout. Within minutes, they were cutting hardware, loosening boards, damaging just enough to be noticeable without drawing immediate attention. They weren't teenagers messing around. They weren't drunk. They were working. I waited until they left before calling it in. When deputies arrived the next morning, I showed them everything. Clear faces, clear actions, timestamp footage from multiple angles. The officers exchanged looks that told me this was no longer routine. They tracked the men down by the truck, caught on camera pulling away from the lake road. The men didn't put up much resistance. Under questioning, the story unraveled quickly. They were part of a landscaping crew hired for various jobs around the neighborhood. They said they were paid in cash and given written instructions about what to do and where to do it. They insisted they didn't know why. They were just told it was authorized. When one of the deputies placed the folded paper on the hood of the cruiser and slid it toward me, my hands went cold. The name printed at the top wasn't Linda's. It was Brian Crowley, her husband. For a moment, the world narrowed to that single detail. Brian Crowley. The name sat there like it didn't belong, like my eyes had misread it. Then the weight of it hit all at once. Linda wasn't acting alone, and she wasn't guessing about my movements. The second realization landed harder. Brian worked at my company. He wasn't some distant employee I'd barely recognized. He was a mid-level operations supervisor, competent, quiet, the kind of guy who kept his head down and delivered reports on time. He didn't report directly to me, but his role fed into my department. He attended meetings. He heard timelines. He knew when I planned to be at the cabin, when I was traveling, when my schedule shifted. Information I never thought twice about sharing in a professional setting suddenly took on a new meaning. Every perfectly timed police visit snapped into focus. The calls always came when I was home, when Evan was there, when activity made us visible. Linda didn't need to guess. She was getting the information handed to her. I felt anger rise, sharp and immediate. But I didn't let it surface. Confrontation would have been satisfying in the moment, but satisfaction fades fast. Evidence less. So I did nothing. At least nothing visible. I copied the footage in multiple formats. I secured written statements from the deputies and the landscaping crew. I made sure every step followed procedure. Then I stepped back and thought carefully about what this meant. Brian wasn't just participating in harassment. He was exposing himself to serious consequences, undisclosed conflicts of interest, misuse of internal information, possibly more, depending on how deep it went. And Linda, for all her confidence, had just tied herself directly to vandalism. I didn't call Brian. I didn't email Linda. I didn't even hint that I knew. I continued responding to HOA messages with the same calm, measured tone as before. I let them believe their pressure campaign was still working. That belief would make them careless. At work, I started paying attention in a different way. I reviewed policies I'd skimmed 100 times before. I documented meeting attendance. I noted what information Brian had access to and when. I didn't accuse. I observed, quietly. What struck me most was how fragile their position actually was. Linda had acted like someone untouchable, someone who believed authority insulated her from consequences. But everything she'd done depended on secrecy, on assumptions, on no one connecting the dots. Now the dots were lined up neatly, waiting. That night, after Evan went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with the lake stretched out in darkness beyond the window. I thought about how close I'd come to reacting emotionally when the vandalism started. How easy it would have been to confront the wrong person at the wrong time and muddy everything. Whoever planned this wanted chaos. They wanted me angry. They wanted a scene. Instead, they'd handed me something far more powerful than outrage. They'd handed me proof. not just of what they were doing, but of who they were willing to involve to do it. The kind of proof that doesn't need embellishment. The kind that speaks for itself. From that point on, I wasn't trying to stop the harassment anymore. I was letting it continue just long enough for the full picture to come into view. Once I understood how exposed the situation really was, I stopped thinking in terms of confrontation and started thinking in terms of pressure. Quiet pressure. The kind that builds without anyone realizing they're standing under it. At work, I didn't march into anyone's office making accusations. Instead, I scheduled a routine conversation with human resources and framed everything as a hypothetical. I asked about conflict of interest policies, about what happens if an employee shares internal scheduling information with someone who's actively involved in a dispute, about outside business dealings that overlap with workplace authority. I kept it calm, professional, almost academic. HR listened carefully. They asked questions. They took notes, and they told me very clearly that situations like the ones I described were taken seriously. Outside of work, I did the same thing with law enforcement. I coordinated with deputies who had already responded to multiple calls at the cabin. Each new incident was formally logged. Each unfounded report added weight to the file. What had once looked like isolated complaints was now unmistakably a pattern. One deputy told me, off the record, that people who abuse emergency systems often underestimate how patient those systems can be, right up until they aren't. The inspectors who had been sent to my cabin so many times began asking different questions too. They weren't just checking boxes anymore. They were curious. They reviewed old records. They compared notes. And then, quietly, they started looking across the lake. Linda's property had expanded over the years. A deck extension here, a structure there. Changes she never seemed to worry about when she was lecturing others on compliance. The inspections revealed multiple additions that had never been permitted. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't been so calculated. I didn't celebrate. I didn't even acknowledge it publicly. I just added the reports to the growing file I kept backed up in 3 separate places. Then Linda crossed a line I hadn't anticipated, but should have. One afternoon, my ex-wife called me, her voice tight and confused. She asked why someone from the HOA had contacted her claiming there were serious safety concerns at the cabin. They'd implied that police activity meant our son was at risk and suggested she consider an emergency custody review. Hearing that sent a cold wave through me. Linda hadn't just targeted me. She'd gone after my family structure. That call became another entry in the record. Dates, names, exact wording, screenshots. My ex-wife forwarded everything she'd received, unsettled but supportive once she understood what was happening. Linda's attempt to weaponize custody didn't scare me into silence the way she probably hoped. It did the opposite. It showed just how far she was willing to go. By that point, I could feel the tension tightening around her. The inspections, the logged reports, the quiet questions at work. She didn't know it yet, but the space she'd been operating in was shrinking. I decided it was time to stop reacting altogether and let her reveal herself. Evan's birthday was coming up, and we planned a small, completely lawful gathering at the cabin. Nothing loud. Nothing excessive. Family, a few friends, food on the grill, and kids laughing by the water. I double-checked every rule. Parking. Noise limits, permits. Everything was clean. I made sure the cameras were running, both visible and hidden, and that backups were set. As the day approached, I could almost feel Linda watching, and sure enough, the timing proved me right. The moment the gathering was in full swing, the next move came. A patrol car rolled down the road. Then another. Shortly after, an inspector followed. Complaints had been filed, allegations made. Once again, nothing was found, but this time was different. This time, everything was captured. The calls, the arrivals, the lack of violations. The contrast between what was being reported and what was actually happening. Linda had been given every chance to stop. Instead, she chose to escalate on record. As the sun set over the lake and the guests left, I stood on the dock and watched the water settle back into stillness. I didn't feel relief, I felt certainty. The pressure had been applied carefully, patiently, and now it was doing exactly what pressure does when it's focused in the right place. All that was left was for Linda to make her final move. And I knew she wouldn't disappoint. The day everything finally collapsed didn't arrive quietly. It came wrapped in noise, cameras, and the kind of confidence only someone feels when they believe they're untouchable. It started, as so many days had, with another call to the police. Then inspectors. Then something new entirely. A local news van rolled into Ridgewater Cove, tires crunching along the gravel road like it belonged there. That was when I knew Linda had decided this wasn't just about pressure anymore. She wanted a stage. By the time I stepped outside, a small crowd had formed. Officers stood near their cruisers, inspectors flipped through clipboards, and a reporter adjusted her microphone while a cameraman framed the shot. Linda stood front and center, perfectly composed, dressed like she was heading into a board meeting rather than accusing someone of endangering a community. She spoke with practiced concern, using words like safety, accountability, and responsibility. She gestured toward my cabin as if it were evidence itself. Anyone watching without context would have thought she was the hero of the story. I stayed calm. I answered questions when asked. I didn't interrupt. I didn't argue. The officers walked through the property again, just like every other time. No violations. No danger. Nothing new. The inspector quietly confirmed everything was compliant. The reporter's expression shifted slightly, curiosity replacing certainty. That's when Linda made her mistake. She turned toward the crowd and said this situation had gone on long enough and that she had proof this wasn't just a misunderstanding. She waved someone forward from behind her. Brian stepped into view. The moment he looked up and saw me standing there, something changed in his face. The color drained out of it so fast it was impossible to miss. His eyes flicked to the camera, then back to me, like he was hoping this was some kind of coincidence. It wasn't. He knew exactly who I was. I could see it in the way his shoulders stiffened, the way his mouth opened slightly and then closed again. The reporter noticed too. She glanced between us, sensing something had shifted but not yet knowing what. One of the officers followed her gaze, then looked back at Brian more closely. Brian tried to speak. His voice didn't quite cooperate. Linda, oblivious or desperate, kept talking, insisting her husband had inside knowledge that proved I was a problem. She thought she was strengthening her case. Instead, she was tearing it open. One of the officers asked Brian a simple question. Where did he get that information? Brian hesitated. The silence stretched longer than it should have. Then another officer asked if he worked with me. Brian swallowed and nodded. He admitted that he was employed at my company, that he reported through my department. You could almost hear the air change. The officers stopped treating the scene like a routine response. Their posture shifted. Their questions became sharper, more specific. They asked about timing, about previous reports, about how Linda knew when I would be at the cabin. Brian stumbled through half answers, each one digging the hole deeper. The inspector closed his folder and stepped back, suddenly less interested in my property and more interested in the people making the complaints. The reporter's camera stayed locked on Linda now. Her confident smile faltered. She tried to laugh it off, tried to steer the conversation back to community standards, but the words came out thinner, strained. She looked around like she expected someone to back her up. No one did. I didn't say much. I didn't need to. Everything that mattered was already documented. Every call, every report, every inspection, every act of vandalism tied back to written instructions bearing her husband's name. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was a pattern, unfolding in real time, with witnesses. Linda's voice rose as she tried to regain control, but it only made things worse. The more she spoke, the more obvious it became that this wasn't about safety. It was about control, about using authority to intimidate someone she wanted gone. And now, with cameras rolling and officers asking the wrong kind of questions, she could see it slipping away. I watched the realization hit her. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. A pause. A glance at Brian. The sudden understanding that the story she'd built so carefully had turned on her. That the spotlight she'd invited was no longer pointed where she wanted it. The reporter asked one final question, directed at the officers, not Linda. She asked whether repeated unfounded calls could be considered harassment. One of the officers answered calmly that yes, they could, especially when patterns and personal connections were involved. That was it. The narrative flipped in an instant. What Linda had framed as vigilant leadership now looked like systematic abuse of power. What she called enforcement looked like obsession, and the woman who thought she was exposing a problem had, instead, exposed herself. As the crowd slowly dispersed and the cameras shut off, Linda stood there, silent now, staring across the lake at a situation she could no longer control. Brian wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. The officers told them both there would be follow-up conversations, formal ones. I stayed where I was, watching the lake ripple gently like nothing unusual had happened at all. The climax hadn't come with shouting or threats. It came with truth, laid out in the open, impossible to ignore. And for the first time since this began, I knew with certainty that it was over. The meeting was scheduled for a week later, and by the time it arrived, word had already spread through Ridgewater Cove. People who hadn't attended an HOA meeting in years suddenly showed up early, filling every chair and lining the walls. There was a low hum in the room, the kind that comes from a community realizing something important is about to happen. Linda sat at the front table, rigid and silent, her usual confidence replaced by a tight, controlled stillness. Brian sat a few seats behind her, staring straight ahead, hands folded like he was bracing for impact. When my turn came to speak, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't dramatize anything. I simply laid everything out, piece by piece, the same way I had lived it. I started with the deed. I held it up so everyone could see the date clearly written across the top, showing that my family's cabin existed decades before the HOA was even formed. I explained what grandfathered meant, not in legal jargon, but plainly, that many of the rules being used against me were never enforceable in the first place. Then I moved on to the police reports. I didn't summarize them. I displayed them, one after another. Or SSB, times, incident numbers, each one marked unfounded. I explained how often officers had been called, how often nothing was found, and how those calls always seemed to coincide with moments when my son was present. The room grew quieter with every page. Next came the footage, still images from the trail cameras. Clear enough that there was no room for interpretation. I showed the damage to the dock, the cut chains, the vandalized property that had belonged to my grandfather. Then I read the statements from the landscaping crew, calmly and without commentary, including the part where they described being paid in cash and given written instructions. I paused before saying the name attached to those instructions. When I did, several heads turned toward Brian at once. I didn't accuse him. I didn't need to. The facts did that for me. I finished by presenting inspection reports from across the lake, reports that showed unpermitted additions on Linda's own property. The same kind of violations she'd threatened others over. I explained that inspectors hadn't been sent there by me, but by the same process she'd been abusing. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. When I sat down, no one spoke for a moment. Then someone near the back asked a simple question. Why hadn't we known about any of this? That opened the floodgates. Neighbors stood up one by one. Some admitted they'd signed petitions because they were scared. Others said they'd felt pressured, cornered, or misled. A few apologized directly to me and my son. What surprised me most was how many said they'd been uneasy for a long time but didn't know how to push back. The vote came quickly after that. There was no shouting. No dramatic speeches. Just emotion, a second, and hands raised. The majority wasn't close. Linda was removed as HOA president on the spot. She didn't argue. She didn't protest. She just stared at the table in front of her like the words no longer mattered. Law enforcement followed up the next day. Formal interviews replaced casual conversations. Charges related to false reporting and harassment moved forward, not as retaliation, but as consequences. Brian was placed on administrative suspension at work, pending an internal investigation. The company took the conflict of interest issues seriously, exactly as policy said it would. And just like that, the noise stopped. No more letters. No more inspectors. No more cruisers creeping past the cabin. The lake returned to its natural rhythm, quiet mornings and soft evenings, the kind Evan used to love. The tension that had wrapped itself around our lives slowly loosened. My son started sleeping better. He asked if friends could come over again. The flinch at sirens faded, replaced by laughter echoing across the water. What struck me most in the aftermath was how fragile the intimidation had been once exposed. It relied on silence, on fear, on the assumption that no one would connect the dots or speak openly. The moment the truth was laid out in daylight, it collapsed under its own weight. The HOA didn't disappear, but it changed. New leadership was chosen, people who spoke about fairness instead of control. Rules were clarified. Protections were put in place so no one else could be targeted the way we had been. The community, shaken but wiser, began to rebuild trust. Standing on the dock one evening, watching Evan skip stones across the lake, I realized something important. The victory wasn't just that the harassment ended, it was that my son got to see how it ended. Not with shouting or revenge, but with patience, documentation, and the quiet power of truth. The intimidation campaign was over. Not because someone was louder, but because someone stayed steady long enough for the truth to speak for itself. When I look back on everything that happened, what stays with me most isn't the anger or the fear. It's what my son learned by watching it all unfold. Evan saw how easy it would have been to lash out, to yell, to make threats of my own. He also saw how quickly that kind of reaction would have destroyed everything we were trying to protect. Instead, he watched me slow down, write things down, and let the truth stack up piece by piece. He learned that real strength isn't loud and it isn't reckless. It's steady. The cabin feels like home again now. The lake is quiet in the mornings, the way it used to be, mist rolling off the water while Evan sits on the dock without flinching at every sound. The fear that once lived in those walls has faded, replaced by something stronger, a sense of safety that came not from winning an argument, but from restoring balance. What this experience taught me is that systems can absolutely be abused by the wrong people. Rules, authority, and even emergency services can be twisted into weapons if no one pushes back the right way. But those same systems can also correct themselves when met with patience, discipline, and evidence that can't be ignored. You don't have to outshout someone who's misusing power. You just have to outlast them with the truth. If sharing this story helps even one person feel less alone or more prepared to stand their ground the right way, then it was worth telling. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?